Welcome to Global Insights by Network 2020, and thank you for joining us for this special edition episode. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We'll be reviewing several key conversations that we've had with experts from around the world, each offering unique perspectives on the 2024 U.S. election and its global ramifications. These discussions span critical regions and themes, from NATO's evolving security challenges to Ukraine, the U.S. China competition, the future of North American trade, and ASEAN's balancing act between two global powers. Now, I usually play more of a backseat role here as the narrator, but for today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by the president of Network 2020 and moderator of all these insightful conversations, Courtney Doggart. Courtney, it's great to have you here with me today.
It is great to be here, Casey.
So what are we here for, Courtney, if you'd like to start us off?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to believe that it's election season, given that it is somewhere above 80 degrees in New York today. So it does not feel like election season, but yet here we are. I think one of the best parts of my job is that I get to talk to so many smart people about what is happening in different parts of the world. And so through those conversations, I think I've had the chance to hopefully glean some nuggets that I can string together. But I think it's really interesting when it comes to the election and foreign policy in general. And I'd like to just use this as a bit of a scene setter, which is that typically U.S. elections don't revolve around foreign policy. It's generally not something that voters seem to consider. That's sort of one of the rules of thumb. And yet this is an election where it seems like some foreign policy questions have been creeping into the voter mindset, whether it's immigration, the war in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East. And so I do think it's important to keep foreign policy in mind. And yet, at the same time, I think it's interesting that the reverse is almost true in a way, too, which is that the U.S. can be a little self-centered in our own way. And I think it's interesting to think about what the rest of the world thinks about U.S. elections, which in some cases is that they are really important and that there are a lot of countries that still would like the U.S. to play that role of, quote unquote, the indispensable nation. And yet at the same time, there are also countries for whom, many for whom it doesn't matter that much. If presidents aren't showing up in certain countries because their bandwidth is so limited, does it really matter who's president? I think it's really interesting that it's been 10 years since a U.S. president has visited the fastest growing continent in the world. And the last presidential visit to Nigeria, which is the most populous country on the fastest growing continent, took place under George W. Bush in 2003. So in the eyes of some countries, maybe it doesn't really matter that much. And so I'd like to just put all of that at the outset just to think about as a little food for thought.
Well, that is a lot to think about. So let's start with Ukraine. A few months ago, Network 2020 hosted an event on the impact of upcoming global elections on NATO's unity and stability. With political shifts and rising isolationist movements, NATO's future could be shaped by key election outcomes across the North Atlantic, including right here in the U.S. Our elections are in a few weeks, and there's growing concern about how different outcomes might impact the war effort and America's role in the conflict. Courtney, what did the panel have to say about this, and what are your thoughts?
It's a great question, and I think it's one where there is the most divergence in the candidate's outlook. And so this is an area where I think there can be a lot of impact. I'd like to start this portion of the conversation by actually playing a clip that I think is worthwhile for the audience to listen to, because it brings up a lot of points that I think are worth digging into. Would you mind putting that on?
Not at all. So this is Rachel Rizzo, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center.
Donald Trump and JD Vance are very different in terms of how they both think about the US role in the world, how they think about alliances, how they think about NATO specifically, and how they think about Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump has said that he will not pull the United States out of NATO, and I think that that's right. But the rhetoric put a lot of fear in people's minds that the United States might not be there to stand by its commitments as a NATO ally. And that is enough, I think, to create weakness in the foundation, because NATO's deterrent effect rests on the shoulders primarily today of the United States. And I think that we should expect tough rhetoric if he and JD Vance are elected in November. JD Vance has sort of been this new emerging voice on both the limits of US military power abroad, but I think also the limits of the benefits that alliances provide for the United States. Trump has also said that he will solve the Ukraine conflict in one day, which is, a bold pronouncement for someone that I don't think really understands the identitarian and imperialist impulses of Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime, and the historical wrongs that Putin believes he is righting. And I mean, this goes so much deeper than just Donald Trump showing up one day and bringing two sides to the table and coming up with a ceasefire line and saying, hold it here. This is just an intractable conflict. And so I worry that if he's elected, Ukraine is going to get a bad deal. And Putin or Trump will use that as a foreign policy win very early on. There's been some sense that Orban could be seen maybe as a go-between here. And I don't actually think that's right. I think that Trump would want to deal directly with Vladimir Putin. He loves strong men. He loves deals. He loves coming to the table and getting things done. And unfortunately, I do think that Ukraine would be on the receiving end of kind of a crappy deal, if I'm being honest. But the problem, too, is that this issue has really been, the issue of Ukraine and NATO has really been polarized in the United States. It has turned into a partisan football. And the Democrats are now sort of seen as the saviors of the transatlantic alliance, the saviors of Ukraine, and the Republicans are sort of seen as the death knell, the potential death knell of it. And that's, I think, a dangerous dynamic that we've gotten into that I would like to see us try to avoid going forward. But no matter what happens in the White House, passing aid for Ukraine comes down to decisions on Capitol Hill. And although the Biden administration was able to get this $60 billion latest tranche of aid passed, I think it's 212 Republicans still voted against it. That is not a small number. That is a very clear partisan line that has been drawn on Capitol Hill. And so I do worry that no matter who comes into the office in November, no matter how pro or anti-NATO or Ukraine they might be, the answers to our policies, the sort of guiding aspect of U.S. foreign policy really comes to the decisions that we're able to make on Capitol Hill. And I really worry that there's going to be a lot of tension up there and potentially really not able to move forward or especially provide more support for Ukraine.
All right. Lots to unpack.
Yes. I mean, it's a long clip, and Rachel gets into, I think, a lot of very important points. And so there's a few that I'd like to touch on. I'm not in a position, I'd just like to say off the bat, to get into questions of dollars or weapons or tactical points. But again, having had lots of conversations with people, hundreds of people over the years, I've been able to pick up on some themes. And one that I think is important at the outset is this idea of isolationism. And the fact that Trump and Vance do seem to be channeling this isolationist nerve that runs through the U.S., even though, Casey, you and I, we've been born in a generation that I think takes for granted, and almost everyone listening has been brought up in this post-World War II global architecture that the U.S. built. But, we do have a history of being unentangled, and that almost seems to be a safe place, I think, for many Americans. I'm not saying it's the right one, but there's this real tension between that isolationist tendency or unencumbered, unentangled tendency, and the very real need to recognize that we live in a global world where alliances are critically important. And so, that's just one point I'd like to bring up based on what Rachel had to say. And then another ties into a common phrase that I hear in the foreign policy world, which is, we need to believe that they're going to do what they say they will do. And I've heard this in connection to what's happening in the Middle East, whether it's talking about Netanyahu or until recently Sinwar. But I argue that there's a corollary, and I think Rachel picks up on it really well, which is that perceptions really do matter. And maybe Trump is all bluster when it comes to NATO, or, maybe like Rachel said, we should believe him when he says that he won't pull out, but perceptions matter. And Europe and our European allies aren't going to play chicken with their own fate. And so, they've really started to bake into their own outlook this potential for pendulum swings in U.S. foreign policy. And so it does matter what we say. Another point that I think is worth talking about is that Rachel doesn't go into it in this part of the clip, but if you watch the full video, the full discussion at the end, she encourages people to watch 20 Days in Mariupol. And she very honestly and candidly questions what it might take in lives lost to win this war. And I do think that, it's unpopular, I think, in certain circles to think about what happens if funding for Ukraine decreases. But I do think it's a reality that might need to be faced. Europe is having a tough time economically, and I don't know that they would necessarily be able to support this war on their own. And Putin is a master of frozen conflicts. Maybe that's his end game here. And, within the U.S., the support for the war, again, it depends on which circles you run in, but Ukraine is not at the top of anyone's list. The issues that Americans seem to care mostly about are things like immigration, climate change, terrorism, and even nuclear proliferation. In a recent poll that I was just looking at from the Institute for Global Affairs, the war in Ukraine was ranked 10 on a list of 12 issues that Americans care about. And this is a polling of partisan Americans. So it's designed to poll Republicans and designed to poll Democrats. And it was ranked 10 on a list of 12 issues that Americans care about. And number 12 was threats to democracy in foreign countries. So I'm not saying that this is not important, but it does seem that after the initial shock and support of Ukraine, it's really fallen victim either to the short American attention span or is crowded out by issues that either feel more important or perhaps more winnable. So that's a long answer to Rachel's clip, but I think she brought up a lot of issues that run through the U.S. response to Ukraine.
Thank you. And you can listen to the rest of Rachel's comments and all the briefings we'll be talking about today by visiting the links in the description of this podcast. Okay, so let's shift gears and dive into U.S. China relations, and specifically trade policy. Back in September, Network 2020 hosted an event on the global transition to renewable energy and the fierce competition between the United States and China. The discussion explored how the two countries are vying for leadership in green technologies like electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries, areas that have significant economic and security implications. But, Courtney, what does this have to do with the elections?
So glad you asked, Casey. I mean, in many ways, everything. I mean, it's such a terrific talk. And I loved this one because it gave me so many interesting nuggets of things to think about that I hadn't thought about before. But what I think is really fascinating about this topic, especially when it comes to elections, is that it really hits on the confluence of several policy questions. So it brings up China, which is, something that really gets people interested. China, climate change, and economic security and competitiveness. I mean, all of those things rolled into one. And by the economic security and competitiveness, I really mean what the U.S. is doing in terms of trade and industrial policy. And that, again, is another area of huge divergence when it comes to a potential Trump or Harris administration. China, I think, has largely been a bipartisan issue. It's moved from this idea of how can we cooperate with China to almost sitting squarely in the realm of how do we compete with China. Yet all experts really seem to agree that we need to work with China in order to effectively address climate change. And so these two thorny policy issues come up here, and in many ways they're at odds with each other. And so, when it comes to green energy competition, yes, it's great that the United States is looking at policies that are in theory designed to address climate change, but they're also shifting the trade environment. They also feed into some of the political tactics, let's just say, of either candidate. And one thing that has also come up in talks that I've either participated in, I'm thinking about a discussion that we had in person recently with Jennifer Hillman, as well as other people I've heard speak, is that trade experts are pretty horrified at the current environment. And trade wars really will have a direct impact on the American people, whether or not they're paying attention to that right now. So maybe we should just take a moment and play a clip from Joanna Lewis, and then we can use that as a touch point for moving forward in the conversation.
All right, let's do it. This is Professor Joanna Lewis, Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service.
A lot of studies have shown, including a lot of my own research, that, if companies see this sort of steady demand, they know that there's going to be a market, they will invest in the factories, right, and the jobs. You just need some stability in the policy system. The IRA it's viewed as relatively resilient from kind of political whims, right? But even that, we know, former President Trump has said, if he comes in, he may not be able to get rid of the IRA, but he could certainly try to kind of take the purse strings, right? Kind of remove a lot of the funding that companies are expecting is going to be there for the next, 10 years plus, right? Because you have to make these investment decisions with long time horizons in mind. And so, that's really the most important thing to think about in designing any policy, right? We don't have to use the protectionism if we're providing the stability and certainty. There hasn't been a major shift in trade policy from, the Trump administration to the Biden administration, for example, vis-a-vis China specifically. I always joke that in many cases, sort of China is one area where the two parties have the most alignment, right? I think we can do more than just sort of place tariffs, right? We can be a little more strategic about what is the impact of these tariffs, how do our trade policies and our industrial policies intersect with our climate policy, what are our ultimate goals? Is our goal to become just fully self-sufficient? Is our goal to become globally competitive? Is our goal to solve climate change? I think these are not always clear, and again, they can be actually quite contradictory depending where we want to go.
So as the second clip mentioned, it seems like U.S. trade policy towards China hasn't shifted drastically across recent administrations. It's interesting that both parties seem to align on this, right?
Yes, indeed. And that has been a theme that keeps coming up is how little things have actually shifted under Catherine Tai, the current U.S. trade rep. I think there are a few important points in here. And I love at the end when Joanna was talking about how we need to be clear on our goals and what that vision is, and that we're just not there yet. And what seems to happen in the process then is that we're taking political routes to solve some of these problems and not thinking about them holistically. And so the result is that you either have Trump and what would likely be, as many seem to say, a whole era of tariffs, which, we're already in a world of increasing tariffs, which is not good for trade. But that seems to be the general direction that things are going in. Or you have the industrial policies of the Biden administration, and then the question becomes, would they continue under Harris? And as Joanna points out, businesses like stability. And so one thing that I've learned from the people we've heard from, and I referred to Jennifer Hillman earlier, and this is something that she said as well, which is that, yes, experts and in general, people do want policies that address climate change, but does it need to be this approach? Does it need to be only tariffs, which probably won't address climate change, or does it need to be industrial policy, which the jury is out on whether or not the government can pick those sorts of winners? Or, what I hear experts wanting is more market-driven mechanisms, whether it's robust carbon trading markets. And another thing that Joanna mentioned as well that I think is worth pulling out, and she might not have mentioned it in this clip, but is that there really needs to be a much more targeted approach to China when we're dealing with where we want to put in certain restrictive policies, and that just isn't happening. So yes, I guess I would just say, a couple of big points to take from this clip is the idea of stability and having stability in, for businesses to operate, and that is incredibly important. The other one is figuring out what the right question is to ask, especially when you're faced with a confluence of policy questions. And policy questions do not often happen in isolation, and you pull on one and then it sort of pulls the whole thread apart. And so we're dealing with climate change, you're dealing with trade, you're dealing with China, and they're all rolled into one. And so it really would help to be clear on what our main goal is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, let's shift focus to North America's economic future. With the election just around the corner, the U.S. relationship with Canada and Mexico will be at a crossroads. A key piece of that puzzle is the USMCA, a trade deal that replaced NAFTA in 2020, with its first review and renewal scheduled for 2026. Courtney, what did the panelists say about the election results and how that could shape the future of this agreement? And what general thoughts do they have on the outlook of North America in light of this election?
Sure. What I loved about this discussion, I'll start there, is that I don't usually think about North America. I really don't. And I hate to say it, but this discussion made me realize just how eastward focused I am when there really is so much potential on our own continent. And too often that conversation, when it comes to foreign policy, is centered around immigration. And I think that this was a really interesting conversation as well, because one of the big questions that we were talking about was, how do we strengthen North America? And if the world is breaking into blocks or minilateralism, how do we strengthen our own bloc? And as I mentioned earlier, too often that conversation is focused on immigration in this election cycle. I don't think one can overstate the extent to which there's a lot of demonizing of immigration. However, in doing so, we're really missing that larger point and that larger opportunity to talk about things like labor mobility and supply chain resilience. And I realize I'm going off a little bit on a tangent here, but what this discussion made me think about was the idea of the theme of immigration and labor. It's one that's come up in multiple times in different conversations that we've had, and it's a challenge in New York State, and it's a challenge in Ukraine. Around the world, there are lots of migrants or internally displaced people, and there's also a need for good workers. And those people are not necessarily in the places where they are needed. And it seems to me that by having really ugly conversations that demonize people, we're missing this bigger point to be thinking constructively about the labor migration nexus, because this challenge is not going away. And again, I'm starting to reference other talks that we've had, but one of my all-time favorites that did not touch on elections, so we don't need to talk about it here, was with Jennifer Shuba on population. And the world, and what I find so fascinating is that the world on aggregate is facing a shrinking population for the first time in human history. So this is something that we've never had to contend with, but that shrinking is not evenly distributed. So on the whole, wealthier nations have hit their demographic high point earlier, and they're attracting people in lesser developed countries in which 96% of the world's growth will take place. And it's also where climate change is impacting the most. So this is a real challenge, and it's also a real opportunity to rethink our societies. And getting back to this talk about North America, I feel like this is a real opportunity to think creatively about that, because right now it's mainly being used for political pandering. But if one can think about it creatively here, that can be a good roadmap for others.
Right. And on the conversation of migration, we'll have both of our briefings on migration dynamics and New York's migration crisis also linked in the description below, so that you can check those out along with everything else we've talked about today. So here's a clip on our episode on North America's economic future. This is Dr. Joshua Meltzer, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, talking about his outlook for the U.S. MCA 2026 renewal.
So I think there's sort of going to be a question, and I think for both a Trump and a Harris administration, there's this open question of how they're going to approach the review. Are they going to kind of use it to essentially try to get Mexico and Canada to move on these issues that the US considers important, threaten to withhold essentially their willingness to kind of renew the agreement in 2026 as kind of the heavy, I guess, stick in the toolkit that you have in the lead up to the review, notwithstanding the fact that would be costly for US businesses if that was actually to happen. The only thing I would kind of add there is that USMCA was obviously the agreement that the Trump administration negotiated, and it's not clear to me how much that will matter to them. Ultimately in 2026, it is quite easy to see how they might kind of spin even that to sort of still want to push quite hard in the review period. So I think we're going to see a challenging 2026 and a lead up into it, I think, under either a Trump or a Harris administration. But I do think ultimately that my sense is that a Harris administration would be more likely, I think, at the end of the day, to renew the agreement in 2026. I think for a variety of both trade and broader sort of geostrategic reasons. I think there's a growing sense in the Biden administration of just how important it is to think about North America in terms of their broader kind of goals around chips and IRA and so forth. It's been imperfect and it's been fits and starts, but I think they're kind of on that journey a little bit. I don't think the Trump administration has started thinking that way about North America yet. I think it will be much more transactional, and I think for that reason, there are higher risks that we kind of run through 2026 and don't get renewal of the agreement.
Dr. Meltzer made a great point about how the renewal of the USMCA in 2026 could reshape long-term economic stability, which feels very similar to what we heard in the green energy discussion. Businesses need predictability to invest.
One of the things that I recall from this conversation in particular was the degree to which both Canada and Mexico were very happy with the USMCA, and the degree to which it seems like Washington wants to start from scratch, despite this being the quote unquote largest, most significant, modern, and balanced trade agreement in history. This is the Trump administration's words. So there seems to be a disconnect between what our northern and southern neighbors think about it and what Washington is thinking about it. I think, the Harris administration, I think, is probably a little more predictable in their outlook, at least in terms of alliances and trade and whatnot. What happens with Trump, given that this is his agreement, who knows? Again, I'm not an expert on either of these politicians' policies, but the themes that emerge for me, again, is one of business predictability, and that just isn't being provided right now. And so there's still that uncertainty. And then another thought that came up to me, and this has come up a couple of times, is that decoupling is, something, and I'm just saying this in light of conversations around supply chains, it's a really hard thing to do. And I think it may have been in this conversation, or it may have been elsewhere, where, someone's referencing the number of times, if you're making a car, that it goes back and forth across borders. It is not, I think, an easy thing to do. And then one final point is, again, goes into the idea of interconnectedness. Mexico and Canada are beneficiaries of the CHIPS Act and the IRA, but, this is in part because we have certain vacuums that we want to fill, when we're trying to take different policy measures, say, toward China, and they need to be filled with countries with whom we have a good working relationship. And so I think that's just something important to keep in mind when we're looking at reviewing the USMCA, whoever gets into power to do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we're almost at the end of our journey around the world, but I'd like to turn our attention to the ASEAN region, which is facing tough choices in navigating the U.S. China rivalry. ASEAN, short for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, includes 10 countries, each with diverse interests, but all watching closely as the U.S. heads into a critical election year. The panelists discussed how shifting U.S. policies could alter ASEAN's delicate balancing act between Washington and Beijing. Courtney, what stood out to you from their perspectives?
Thanks, Casey. I think that there are a couple of points that I wanted to address when it comes to this talk and ASEAN. The first is, and you touched on this in your intro just now, which is that a lot of countries around the world, and they may be in ASEAN, they may be elsewhere, they're looking at a world that is shifting dramatically and trying to figure out how they can grow economically. Certain governments, almost every government, they're trying to figure out how to stay in power. And they're looking around the world in their neighborhood to figure out how best to do that. And these aren't always clear-cut choices. And so some of the words that have come up with different speakers we've had have been phrases like fuzzy bifurcation, or my personal favorite from the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, polyamorous. So
we should try to get a clip of that.
We don't have that on record, but what I find very important about that is that it is really good to note that countries they're looking out for their own interests. They're trying to make deals that balance, whether it's, aligning politically in one sphere and economically in another, but it's not always clear cut. And I think that's very much the case for ASEAN countries, particularly, if you're looking at a country like Vietnam, right, that is largely a beneficiary of China plus one policies, right? But they're thinking about their own future, and it's not always going to be 100%, only go in the direction of the U.S. They need to balance with China. They need to look around their larger neighborhood. And so there's a lot of interesting approaches that different countries need to make. Why don't we play the clip, and then I can use that as a jumping off point for a couple other points that I wanted to make.
All right. So this is Dr. Pek Kun Hung, former director of the ASEAN Studies Initiative at American University's School of International Studies, as well as Ambassador Ted Osius, former U.S. ambassador to Vietnam and president and CEO of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council.
ASEAN countries on the whole, they trust U.S. more for upholding the rule of law and the norms of free trade better than they trust China. So that is important, a factor to look at. Now, so going to Biden and Trump. So when Biden took over from Trump in 2021, there was a slight uptick in the level of confidence, towards the U.S. But that has since been dissipated, as Ambassador Osius says. The Hamas war, because 40% of the population in ASEAN are Muslims, and also so there's one that is the Hamas, and then the Israel war and America's support for Israel, and the second one is economic. Is that there is really ASEAN don't see an alternative to the TPP that would have enabled qualifying ASEAN members access to the American market and a high quality free trade, multilateral free trade arrangement. IPEF is seen to be a very poor substitute because it does not allow access to the American market. Now, by contrast, China is ASEAN's number one trade partner. ASEAN derives benefits from the China-ASEAN free trade agreement, and also, of course, the BRI investments that is available to ASEAN. So under Biden, if Biden wins the elections, I don't see that decline as being stopped. I see that it will, because there's no economic alternative from the U.S. They're looking for an economic alternative. There's none there. And Hamas, the war in Israel may drag on. So, but having said that, the return of Trump holds even less appeal for ASEAN. Mega on steroids. What will this mean? Protectionist policies, the unpredictability of Trump. And so that Trump's presidency will, I feel, give more opportunities and more space for China to become the dominant power in Southeast Asia.
I think there are plenty of people in ASEAN who aren't particularly troubled by the idea of Trump 2.0 because he's seen as a tough guy. He's seen as someone who stands up to China. But then they also look at the Biden administration, which has been also pretty tough, especially in imposing tariffs on key Chinese goods. So I don't think there's a uniform view across ASEAN, just as there isn't a uniform view across U.S. companies about which is the better scenario in November. But business likes stability, predictability. That matters in the business context. And the Biden administration, we kind of know where it's going. It's pretty predictable. I wish they had a stronger trade policy, but our politics don't allow that at the moment. There's been a reversal of U.S. trade politics, so that you don't have a whole lot of Republicans arguing for free trade. That used to be the party that argued for free trade, and then you have a lot of Democrats who voice their concerns about inequality, environment, and labor. The aspects of trade that are troubling. And so until we can get our act together, we're not going to be taking full advantage of the opportunities that exist for us in the Indo-Pacific.
Business and stability.
Yeah, there you go. Theme number one, right there. Business like stability. And there it is again. A couple other reactions to those clips. One, I also think it underscores that what I spoke about earlier, the idea of that fuzzy bifurcation and that things are not clear cut. And the fact that one across ASEAN, there is not a uniform outlook. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And that in some parts, the idea of having, a tougher stance on China might be welcome. But on the other hand, there's this notion that I think is really important to dig into as well, which is that nature abhors a vacuum. And if there is a vacuum, someone will come to fill it. And around the world, often that is China when the United States is not there. And I think that that's a really important point. And it's one that we had a conversation, a different one with Jennifer Hillman and Jude Moore, who used to be, I forget his role in the Liberian government, but he was saying the same thing, and this happens across the board. It's that often countries would like to do business with the United States, but if we're not there, they're going to do business with whoever's around, and often that is China. And so I think that that's just a really important point that we need to keep in mind. A couple other important points that I think were brought up here is the interconnectedness point again. I thought it was fascinating when Dr. Hang mentioned the role that that Israel's war on Hamas and how that is being perceived across ASEAN nations, and whether that is a solidarity, for lack of a better word, with other people around the world, or if it's just the distraction of other conflicts. I think that again, nothing is happening in isolation, and so I think that is just something really important to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Well, we've come to the end of our whirlwind tour around the world. The stakes are high, and what seems to be consistent across every discussion is the sense that the world is anxious and waiting to see which direction the U.S. will take next. Courtney, given all we've discussed, do you have any thoughts about what we've discussed today, or what stands out to you most about how the world is bracing for the outcome of this election?
Well, I wanted to say a few things. One is, gosh, I wish I knew how the world were preparing. I think it's one where countries are comprised of people, and people are trying to be pragmatic, and they will try to prepare for either outcome. And I would like to circle back to something that I said at the beginning, where in some cases it doesn't matter as much as we think it does, especially if we're not there. And that's a bandwidth issue, right? It's hard to be everything to all people, and it's the same for a country in a world with lots and lots of countries. So I think it's a tricky juggling act for the United States to play, and in some cases we do it more effectively than others. I did want to point out, though, that there is a glaring gap in our tour of some of the foreign policy questions, and we didn't touch on the Middle East, and that is in part because we didn't have really good election-specific clips. But I did want to point out that we do have some really good content, I think, on the Middle East in general, really starting back in 2021 with the most recent pre-October 7th conflict, which and some other conversations that we've had prior to October 7th that I think provide some context on what led, just some of the context before the horrific attacks of a year ago, and then just the subsequent horror that has happened in Gaza and now Lebanon. And so I do encourage people, if they're interested in that, to revisit some of those old episodes as well, even though they're not election specific, but I think that they're well worth understanding what's happening.
Well, Courtney, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. Now here's Courtney for a bit more detail on what Network 2020 does, as well as what's upcoming.
And just as background for those who might be joining us for the first time or who stumbled upon this and are wondering a little bit more, Network 2020, we are a nonprofit. We're based in New York, and we're really trying to have more informed, nuanced conversations about international affairs. we're often looking at that intersection of the private sector and international affairs, but we cover all sorts of topics. And just as a note as well, for those who are interested in the impact on the U.S. elections on foreign policy and what the implications are, we do have some events that will take place after the election to dig into these results, including a member-only briefing in New York. It's a private briefing for members, and you can always learn how to join on our website with Ishan Tharoor, who is the worldview columnist at the Washington Post, and he just does a phenomenal job at bringing in global perspectives into his work and thinking about what Washington policies look like around the world and sort of how they're being perceived and how the U.S. is being perceived. So he'll be digging into that on November 7th. And then we're nothing concrete yet, but we are planning some conversations that will be looking at grand strategy following the election as well. And so rest assured that we will be digging into these topics either on a high level or on a very regional or thematic level that will be publicly available in the coming weeks and months.
Great.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Casey. All right. Okay.